We'll now get the next section going, which is Should I or Shouldn't I? Clinical Trials, Are They Right for Me? Jürgen Venitz, whose MG was acting up, is not here. He was going to be a participant in this section, but he is calling in, so he'll be on the line to participate. The other panelists are Robert Klansman, MD, who is the Executive Director of and Neuroscience Lead at Global Medical Science at Lexion, and Jonathan Shinefeld, a registered nurse at Temple University Hospital and a member of the MGFA NAB.
Good morning. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is John Shinefeld. I'm getting direction. Is that better? I'm a nurse, and I have to confess at the outset, I know very little about clinical trials. I do not speak from authority about clinical trials, but Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Venitz, who will be calling in later, certainly can speak to those. What I can talk about is a nursing perspective on clinical trials. I'm speaking as a nurse, as I said, and as a myasthenia patient, and was approached with the possibility of participating in this roundtable discussion. I might parenthetically add, not knowing I needed a slide deck, but was asked to participate in this roundtable discussion and agreed from a position of curiosity. So that's how I approached this. I wanted to learn about clinical trials and put that information together with my professional experience as a nurse to raise issues today for you as people with myasthenia and family and supporters to think about in terms of clinical trials, whether or not a clinical trial is right for you, and if you think maybe it is, which clinical trial might be right for you. It occurred to me that as I read through this over and over again, that these questions could be construed as cynical. I don't at all mean them to be cynical. I do believe that we have a responsibility to be well educated, and to become well educated, we need to be willing to ask questions. I will speak briefly about clinical trials simply to frame some issues, and again, Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Venitz will speak more in depth about the ins and outs of clinical trials. What's the point of a clinical trial? A clinical trial looks at an issue that has not been thoroughly researched or solved or resolved, and looks to compare existing treatment with some proposed new treatment. They're very, very narrowly focused on very specific populations, very specific disease groups. They're highly organized, highly supervised, and their outcome is data. And then clinicians take that data, spin it into information, and can use it to help inform rational decision-making by patients and families. Clinical trials are incredibly expensive. Dr. Burns was up here yesterday speaking about them. Are you in the room, Dr. Burns? Yes, I'm sure. Thank you. Fantastically expensive, incredibly complex endeavors. You and I are not going to undertake a clinical trial. But who does? Obviously, people with deep pockets, people who can finance big bills, and people who have organizations that have the infrastructure to support the complexity of the experimental design and the reporting and the management process. So the Fed, obviously, the VA, the National Institutes of Health, private business, big pharma, academic medical centers typically have the pockets and the infrastructure to support clinical trials, and clinical trials and research are typically at the heart of the mission of an academic medical center. And more near and dear to us today, MGFA also supports clinical trials. So at some point, somebody might want to ask after the presentation, why would an organization go to all this trouble? Trials are managed by protocols. Protocols define who participates, how they participate, how the study works, how the data is reported, and so on, what the endpoints are, when the trial ends in general, and when the trial ends for the individuals who are enrolled in it. Without getting lost in the weeds, clinical trials, typically, historically, are defined by phases. From the top where it says preclinical down to phase 4, what we need to remember about this is that the earlier stages are perhaps the drugs are perhaps less well defined in terms of efficacy and effectiveness. As you move down towards the higher levels, towards the more refined levels, studies are generally considered safer, and then eventually, for a few of those trials, they actually go to market. I was privileged to attend a surgical grand rounds at Temple University Hospital a couple weeks ago, where a surgeon from the University of Miami, who now that I'm standing up here, his name completely escapes me, presented surgery and adjunct chemotherapy. And what he was actually talking about was genetically tailored drugs to address cancers. And one of the outcomes of his talk is that this structure may necessarily have to change to accommodate these specifically customized drugs. A drug that's introduced now has a relatively low percentage opportunity to succeed. The chances of success are small, often. With genetically tailored therapies, the chances of success may be 80, 85, perhaps 90% in some cases. So less to weed out. Who oversees clinical trials from the big level, from the global perspective? The FDA. The FDA is federally funded. It's a legislatively mandated process. They look at the great big issues. They look at the big informed consent issues. They ensure things like patients can withdraw at any point. And they look at advocacy issues also to make sure that patients are informed about what's hot and what's not, what's upcoming in clinical research while you're enrolled in the trial. I went out on the website last Saturday, and on the front page of the FDA website, their news release was the FDA approves the first generic, I can't say that, Copaxone to treat multiple sclerosis. I thought that was incredibly encouraging news. At a closer level, who oversees them? IRBs, institutional review boards. Sometimes I guess they're called ORBs, organizational review boards. These are nitty-gritty, sometimes down in the weeds, oversight bodies that look at study design. Their role is to protect the patients and to protect the integrity of the study itself. They ensure that studies are ethical, that they're rational, that they're well designed. They have the authority to say no to a study and to recommend changes to a study design to be resubmitted. They also have responsibility for follow-up, and that's going to be important, as you'll see in 1 minute. We're going to come back to this slide after Dr. Vennett's talks. We're going to go out to the website and look at the clinicaltrials.gov, and it's also in your handout. This website is in your handout. We'll go out to that website to show you how accessible this information can be. All right, should I or shouldn't I? Anybody in the room ever considered a clinical trial? Yes? Maybe? Yes? Relatively few. Why would you consider a clinical trial? This morning, Ann Williams and I were talking about this, and she raised a story about a friend of hers who had ALS, who enrolled in a clinical study, and he realized that any findings from this study would probably not help him very much, but would certainly help future generations with the disease. So altruism. There's hope. If we're muddling along with myasthenia and we're not satisfied with our physical outcome and our physical status and what we're able to do, perhaps a drug in a clinical trial gives us some hope of living better. This next one, self-determination, is huge. I'm a nurse. I make a rotten patient. A clinical trial offered me the possibility of taking charge somehow of my own care. And of course, there's the potential for early access to new, valuable therapy. So that's one hand. On the other hand, somebody is the control group. As we heard yesterday from our keynote speaker, anecdotal evidence is interesting. The miraculous recovery from MS was a member of a control group. That patient was not getting the drug. So somebody's in the control group. There are unforeseen consequences, particularly in the earlier phase trials, to the drug or to perhaps foregoing your current therapy to participate in the trial. By nature of a clinical trial, we don't necessarily know what the outcomes are going to be. And clinical trials are a significant personal commitment. Chances are they're not in your backyard. Chances are they're not going to come to you. So there's a big time commitment. You are agreeing to participate, perhaps to travel. You're going to get poked and prodded and examined and monitored, and people are going to ask questions that you never really thought you'd have to answer. Clinical trials, this is when rational thought just flies right out the window. After the last conference, I was approached to participate in a phase 2 clinical trial. And I looked at this thing and I thought, yeah, this is it. This is for me. And I went and talked to my neurologist about it. And not quite in so many words, he said, "What are you, nuts?" His point was, it's a phase 2. There are unknown consequences of it. Some of the known consequences of it are potentially serious. These are things to think about. So the risks may not be well known. They may not be well understood. We hope for the benefits. They're certainly not a sure thing. Lots of other questions. Who pays for this? What happens to your insurance if you are a participant in a clinical trial? Does your insurance continue to cover you? It's something to think about. It necessarily involves some separation from your current care team. Most of us have significant relationships with our care teams, with our neurologists. If you're participating in a clinical trial, it means a whole new set of relationships. Nitty-gritty stuff. Some clinical trials involve you self-administering drugs. You need to know how. If you're participating in a trial, do you know that the folks who are giving you those drugs understand what they're doing, what they're giving you? I think the biggest issue here is trust. Most folks are familiar with the Tuskegee experiments. Yes? No? 40 years worth of, let's see what happens when we don't treat syphilis on a population of African American men in Tuskegee, Alabama. It did not end well for anybody. Less well known, the Philadelphia prison experiments. There was a dermatologist in Philadelphia named Albert Kligman who was in cahoots with Dow Chemical Company and for about 25 years was performing unsanctioned experiments. The outcomes of these experiments resulted in a lot of the acne drugs that hit the market in the late 70s and 1980s. When he was, if you can read the subtext there, Alan Hornblum wrote a book exposing all this, and one quote in there from Dr. Kligman was that when he walked into this prison, all he saw was acres of skin. He saw potential clinical subjects, and there were no protocols in place to protect anybody or to define well what was being done in either of these situations. Trust, transparency in reporting. Without getting lost in the numbers here, although they're important, the takeaway is that this was just published 2 months ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. The takeaway is that relatively few studies who are obligated to report, whose IRBs technically are supposed to oversee that reporting, actually report their outcomes. in a timely manner. Eventually, probably, yes, they do get reported. But along the way, not so much. So it lends something to the trust issue, I think. The conclusion from all this is that the role of the study entity, whether it's academics or a pharmaceutical company or the government, and the institutional review board that's overseeing it, and your personal physician, and everybody involved, is absolutely essential to be able to participate rationally. Not just the data, but turning that data into information that we can make rational decisions. If clinical trials are appropriate, which clinical trial is appropriate?